is it the thought that counts, or is it the act that counts? Is it the kavanah, or is it the doing? Now, obviously, in order to serve God properly, we have to have two dimensions. There must be two realities. One is the person who is serving, and the other is God who is being served. So when we say serve God, when we say we were created to serve God, we're actually saying two things. Firstly, that we are to serve God, and secondly, that we are to serve God. And that's why there's freedom of choice. Why is there freedom of choice? Because if I didn't have freedom of choice and I put on tefillin in the morning, then God would have been served, but not by me. Because it wouldn't be my choice. It wouldn't be my thought. It wouldn't be my feeling. It wouldn't be my decision. And so I wouldn't be participating. So the mitzvah would get done, the tefillin would be worn, but not by me. There wouldn't be a me if I didn't have freedom of choice. To a lesser degree, if my freedom of choice is temporarily postponed or interfered with, for example, I'm forced to put on tefillin, physically coerced to put on tefillin, again, it wouldn't be me doing it. To an even lesser degree, if I did put on the tefillin willingly, but under a false understanding or a misconception of what it was that I was doing, for example, I thought I was doing something else, and in fact I was putting on the tefillin, then again, the mitzvah got done, but not by me, because my mind, my consciousness was a million miles away. I thought I was doing something else. So that if I don't actively engage mind or heart or both in the mitzvah, then I am not serving God, because it isn't me. It's happening in spite of me or without me. So I'm not serving God, and therefore part of the mitzvah isn't there. And that's why the kavanah is crucial. Because if it's not your kavanah, then it's not you who is serving God. So if you don't have any motivation to do the mitzvah, if you're not doing the mitzvah voluntarily, willingly, with some kind of involvement on your part, then you're not there. You're simply not there. Someone else is doing it. So you're not serving God unless you have kavanah. Now, kavanah can mean many things. It could mean that you have the right attitude of mind, that you're thinking, I am doing this because this is what a Jew is commanded to do by God, and that's why I'm doing it. Kavanah can also mean an activity of the heart. You're putting on the tefillin because you feel Jewish. You love being Jewish because you love God. Or you do the mitzvah out of fear of God, which is not a state of mind, but a state of heart. That too is called kavanah. It's input. If a person does a mitzvah with no feeling, neither fear nor love, without any thought, motivation, or thoughtful purpose, or awareness, or involvement, then there is no kavanah. Except that in Tanya we're told that since the neshama of every Jew is always active, the soul of the Jew is always alive and active, therefore the kavanah of the neshama and the act of the mitzvah, although they're separated by an absence of a conscious awareness, there's a conscious gap, because the conscious mind and conscious heart are not engaged, are not meshing with the act of the mitzvah. But on the other hand, since the neshama, or the unconscious part of the Jew, is awake and alive, and knows what it's doing, and appreciates the mitzvah, and the mitzvah is getting done, there is the act of the mitzvah, then God will make that connection and bring the two together. And then we have a mitzvah with wings, meaning to say a mitzvah that is alive, a mitzvah that contains both body and soul, composed of both body and soul. So there's no question that kavanah is essential. But the very reason that makes kavanah essential, that which makes kavanah important, also makes it limited and incomplete. Because what are we saying? We're saying that the kavanah is the you that engages in the mitzvah. The purpose of the mitzvah is to serve God. To serve someone means that you put yourself aside, you put aside your needs, your wants, and your purposes, and you serve the purpose and the want and the need of the person whom you are serving. In a marriage, for example, if a guy decides that he's going to be a model husband, he's going to be a perfect husband, and he read in certain books that a perfect husband does this and that and the other, and so he's going to do this, that, and the other. Now, his wife isn't interested in this, that, and the other. But to be a perfect husband, that's what you're supposed to do according to the book, according to his own opinion, maybe. He thinks that that's what makes a good husband, and so he's doing it. Now, she doesn't want that. She wants something else. She's not interested in what all women are interested in. But he doesn't notice. He doesn't care, because he is busy being a good husband. Well, in this sense, in this case, he has all the right kavanah. He is involved. He's doing it willingly, with enthusiasm. His mind is engaged in this activity. His heart is engaged in the activity. But now, whom is he serving? To serve means that you satisfy the other party's wants or needs, that you go by the other party's thoughts, not by your own. So what makes the kavanah important is that it's your own thought, that it's your voluntary involvement. It's the human part of you. But for that very reason, it isn't enough. Because we have only the half that makes it your serving. It's very valid when people come along and say that they don't want to say the same prayers that have been said for thousands of years. They want to participate. They want to engage. They want to be involved. That's very fine. But what do you want to be involved in? A husband wants to be a perfect husband, but to whom? Not to his wife, because she doesn't like what he is doing in his attempt to be perfect? Let's look at the other side. Let's look at the virtue of the act. In doing the act of the mitzvah, possibly without the kavanah, without the thought, without the feeling, just the act itself, what do we have? We have basically the truth and reality of God expressed in the physical world. I don't know if it's a very good example, but the Gemara says that Yaakov never died. So the Gemara asks, what do you mean he never died? The Chumash tells us, Torah tells us, that he was buried or embalmed or something of that sort, that the eulogies were said. So what does it mean that he never died? So the Gemara answers that since his children are alive, therefore he is alive. Which means, in practical terms, that to be alive means to have an effect, to make an impression. If a person goes through 80 years of life and has had no effect, has made no impression, then he hasn't really lived at all. And that's why people who get depressed, emotionally, mentally depressed, they feel like they're not making an impression. Nobody's listening. The typical threatening note, the suicide note says, now you'll listen, I'll teach you, I'm going to make an impression. Because for some reason, they felt that they were not making any impression at all. And to make no impression at all means not to live at all. So you might as well die. The worst fear that a person has is that he goes through the motions, he goes through the activities, and in the end result, it may not amount to anything. The world may be exactly the same with him or without him, and therefore he is not alive. So life means to have an impression. To make an impression. Gemara says that since his children are alive, he is therefore alive. Which means the children are living the way he instructed them to live. So that if a kid gets up in the morning and he says Moda Ani, the way his father told him to say it, then the father is having an effect. The father is very much alive in that room. And it doesn't make any difference whether he's having the effect from down the hall or from the other world where his soul now lives. Either way, he is alive in this room. He is having an effect in this room. His existence is changing things, is causing things to happen. It's making the child sit up and say the Moda Ani. The fact that he existed on earth is still having an impact on earth. So he hasn't left earth at all. He is still alive on earth, not just in heaven. Every soul is alive in heaven, because all souls are eternal. But when we say that Yaakov is alive, we mean here on earth. And how is he alive on earth? Because he is effective on earth, and that's what life is. As a matter of fact, I mean, some people, some parents are more alive after they've died than during their actual lifetime, because after they've died, their children are suddenly more affected by their parents' wishes or teachings or instruction than they were while the parents were still here on earth. The wishes are now coming true. The parents' instructions are now being followed. The teachings are being kept. And what does this mean in a very simple terms? If a kid gets up in the morning and he says Moda Ani because his father told him to, then the father is very much in evidence. And that it gives the father life. When we do a mitzvah, the act of a mitzvah, then we are doing what God commanded, and we're doing it here on earth. When a person with freedom of choice, with a mind of his own, with a heart of his own, with needs of his own, weaknesses of his own, puts all that aside and says, wait a minute, there's time for that. Right now, I want to know, what does God say to do? So you take a look. What is today? Today's Rosh Hashanah. Then God wants me to blow shofar. So what is happening? What's happening is that not only is God evident in the act or by the virtue of the act, not only is he evident in this world, but that he is truer and greater and more real in this world than our own needs, our own wants, and our own opinions. Because who is doing the act? A human being with a mind and heart and will of his own. And all that can be set aside, is set aside, so that God's wish or God's command gets done. So what is now in evidence? Not only that God exists, God's presence or influence in the world, but that his influence is greater than the influence of my needs and wants. My own desires and weaknesses can all be put aside. For example, I'd rather be sleeping, and yet because it's Rosh Hashanah, I am awake and I'm listening to the shofar. So God's influence is greater than the influence of my tiredness or my laziness or my desire to sleep. So the truth we're supposed to be revealing in this world through all mitzvahs and by our very being, the truth that God is the only reality and that everything else pales and disappears and becomes insignificant in the presence of God's reality. How does that get expressed? Where do we see that? When a Jew does the act of a mitzvah. The act of the mitzvah is God's part of the mitzvah. The kavanah is our part. And it may be a bit extreme, but it brings the message home. An extreme example. We're reading about the Jews in Russia, particularly about the Hasidim, who were imprisoned for their activities on behalf of Yiddishkeit, for building the mikveh, for teaching their children Hebrew, for raising money for the underground yeshiva. And these Hasidim spent anywhere between 12 to 18 years in prison, in labor camps in Siberia, and through it all continue to observe all the mitzvahs. One particular Chassid, who was at the North Pole, in a totally primitive village near the Arctic Ocean, he was sharing this hut with one of the local peasants, similar to American Eskimos, the Russian Eskimo. This guy had 2 kerosene lamps. He used one for himself, and he would light one for the Chassid. Now, the first Friday night that the Chassid was there, this Eskimo, this peasant, lit the lamps, both for himself and for the Chassid. Now, according to halacha, if a non-Jew does any of the prohibited labors on Shabbos, and he does it expressly for you, then you're not allowed to enjoy or benefit or use that product during Shabbos. So that if a non-Jew cooks food for you on Shabbos, you're not allowed to eat it. And that's why the way that traditionally in the shtetl, the way that a non-Jew was asked to turn on the fire or light the fire or turn off the fire on Shabbos so that the food could be warmed was by having him share in the food, so that he knows that he's turning on the fire to warm the food not only for the Jewish family but for himself as well, and then we're allowed to participate. But if he's doing it only for you, then he represents you, and you are not allowed to do this on Shabbos, and therefore he's not allowed to do it for you. So what happened was, the guy lights this lamp for himself, and then he lights another lamp for the chassid. And after years of being out there in Siberia, half frozen to death, starved and tortured, the devotion of this man in his Yiddishkeit is unbelievable. Something as seemingly insignificant as having a non-Jew do something for you on Shabbos, and yet even this he wouldn't allow. Even this didn't slip past him. He was very much alert and aware, not forgetful of Yiddishkeit in all of its details. So he says to the guy, he says, I'm a religious person, and I can't use the lamp you're giving me. I need your lamp. And he says, why? He says, well, it's complicated. It's too complicated to explain, but if it's all the same to you, I'd rather have your lamp, and you take the one you've given me. So the peasant says, fine, take my lamp. He takes the other lamp. The next week, Friday night comes around, and this peasant, the non-Jew, remembering what had happened the week before, now takes his own lamp and lights it for the chassid. So the guy says, this week I need it the other way around. And the guy says, what are you, crazy? You're making me nuts. So all of the various experiences that this guy writes about in his diary includes the various circumstances that the Shulchan Aruch, that the Code of Jewish Law discusses, that may occur, that one might find himself in Pesach. So that, for example, there's the question of what to do if Pesach comes around and you find that you have wine for the 4 cups, but you don't have the matzah. So what do you do? And then there's a discussion of a circumstance where you have the matzah, but you don't have wine for the 4 cups. What else can you use as substitute for wine? There's a discussion about that. And of course, there's the possibility of not having either wine nor matzah. So this chassid says that in the years that he spent out in Siberia, he covered all 3 possibilities. There was a year that he had matzah in Siberia, but he couldn't get any wine. There was a year that he could get some wine, but there was no way he could get his matzah. And there was a year where he had neither wine nor matzah. Bitter herbs, he says, that he had plenty. Bitterness, there was no shortage of out there. But imagine a chassid who is so scrupulous in all the details of Yiddishkeit and all the mitzvahs, and he knows that today is Pesach. And how he knows and how they kept track of the months and so on is another story in itself. But they knew every Yom Tov. So this chassid knows that it's the Seder night. And here he's sitting in this village called Che, cut off from the world, because 9 months of the year the ships couldn't get through and the sleds couldn't get through. So it's Pesach night, and he doesn't have any matzah. And this chassid is sitting there thinking about the significance of matzah on Pesach, how much he wants to have matzah, how he can't tolerate spending Pesach without the matzah. He would give anything to have a piece of matzah this night, and he cries bitter tears, although it's not his fault, and although he knows that he's completely exempt under the circumstances, he is exempt from the mitzvah, and he will not be held responsible for it, for not having the matzah. And yet, he's brokenhearted. He doesn't have matzah for Pesach. So he had this raw egg. He broke open the egg and he drank it down, and that was his 4 cups. And then he writes in his diary that all the years that he had been suffering, his legs were swollen with hunger, and his life was in danger over and over again, and yet he had never cried. But after that l'chaim that he said on the raw egg, something happened to him, and he broke down and he cried. Because Pesach without matzah, couldn't take it. Now, we admire such a person. We can appreciate the nobility of such a person. But the strange thing is that night, out there in Siberia, the Seder night, This chassid, for all of his nobility, for all of his greatness, for all of his sensitivity, for all of his devotion, that night the chassid did not fulfill the mitzvah. God was not evident that night in this little hut in the village of Che. He, the chassid, was evident, impressively evident. His virtue was very much in evidence. But God was not, because what God wants on Pesach night, what God commands us to do on Pesach night, never happened. Another example. Another event that happened to the same man. There was another year where before the snows had melted and they were completely cut off, and they hadn't received any message or any letters for a long time, they suddenly got a message that a general, some high-ranking general of the Russian army, was in a distant town further up north, closer to the sea, and that he wanted to be transported to this village, and somebody was to go out and pick him up. One of the guys there, a Russian worker, was told that he would have to hook up his sled and go pick up the official. He was very afraid. He was certain that the sled would break through the ice and he would drown. But because they had been cut off for so long, and none of the prisoners had gotten any of their packages and their mail from home, they all begged him to bring back their packages. And he swore to them, with no uncertain terms, that he would bring back nothing, because he didn't want to add to the weight of the sled. When he got to the town, which was considered the big town, it had a post office. The guy at the post office was so happy to see him because he was waiting to get rid of all these packages that were cluttering up his office. But the sled driver refused to accept any of the packages, but finally agreed to take the letters. But then the guy in the post office says, there's one box you have to take. There's one box you must take because it's from Moscow. And these people were very impressed with Moscow. And not only was it from Moscow, but it had many stamps on it because they had purposely sent it in a circuitous route so that it would take longer to get there. And they had many stamps on it because every post office, every city had put its stamp on. And this guy in this primitive village had never seen so many government stamps and thought this must be, who knows, what kind of important box this must be. And so he says, this box you're going to have to take because if you don't, they'll just send you back for it again. And so that was the one box that he brought back to the village. And it turns out that the box is addressed to the chassid. And in it are 3 pounds of matzah. And this was 2 days before Pesach. And all the prisoners knew that this chassid was in grave danger of starving to death on Pesach because he wouldn't touch any of the food. They knew that he wouldn't eat the bread because it's bread, and that he wouldn't eat any of the other foods that the natives ate there, such as raw fish or raw meat. They ate raw meat there, deer meat and polar bear meat. But of course it wasn't shechted, it wasn't kosher, and he couldn't eat it. So he wouldn't eat the meat, and he wouldn't eat the bread, and they weren't always guaranteed that they would catch kosher fish, and so they were afraid that he was going to starve to death. And then all of a sudden, this box arrives with the matzah in it. At any rate, the other prisoners there, these criminals, the cutthroats, the peasants of the village, were so thrilled by this, they were so impressed, that they lifted him up on their shoulders and they danced with him, saying that the God of Israel is powerful, and that this man is a tzaddik, is a saintly man. There was one other Jew in this village, also arrested, but he was arrested for crimes. He was a crook. He wasn't observant at all. And the chassid says to him, he says, come, now we'll be able to celebrate Pesach. You'll come to my hut and we'll make a Seder together. So the non-Jews, the other prisoners there, objected. They started screaming and they said, don't give him any matzah. He's no good. He's not a good Jew. We saw him eating a bird. He killed a bird and he ate it. So don't give him anything. But the chassid says to the Jew, he says, if you promise not to eat any non-kosher food for the 7 days of Pesach, then we'll share the matzah. So the non-Jews, these criminals, sneak into the hut of this other Jew, and they said to him, that chassid, that man is godly. He's a holy man. And you're going to do exactly as he tells you, or we will kill you. We catch you eating something you're not supposed to be eating, and you're dead. And so, I suppose he did. He ate the matzah. Now let's compare. This Jew who doesn't want to eat matzah, doesn't want to celebrate Pesach, but a bunch of gangsters, cutthroats, are threatening him that if he doesn't behave himself and he doesn't eat it, they will kill him. And so he eats the matzah on Pesach. And on the other hand, we have the chassid who last year didn't have any matzah for Pesach and was sitting in his hut crying bitter tears because he wanted to do the mitzvah. And for all of his good intentions, as much as we admire his devotion and love for God, the chassid did not do the mitzvah that night when he had no matzah. And therefore, God was not evident there. But this guy, who didn't want to eat the matzah, who was forced to eat the matzah by criminals, when he ate the matzah that night, God was evident in that act. We don't admire the person. We don't admire him because it didn't have much to do with him. He was forced. But the mitzvah was done. A Jew ate matzah on Pesach. God was very much in evidence. And therefore the chassid, after crying his heart out for not having matzah, had he suddenly, miraculously received a piece of matzah, he would have a mitzvah to perform. He would have to make a bracha and eat the matzah, as long as it was still Pesach. But this other guy, after he ate the matzah, under coercion, had he suddenly decided that he wants to be a good Jew, and that from now on he's going to keep the mitzvahs and practice them willingly and voluntarily, does he have to eat another piece of matzah? No. He has fulfilled the mitzvah. And if he were to make another bracha over the matzah, he would be making the bracha in vain, because he had already fulfilled God's mitzvah. So what is the difference between the person being in evidence and God being in evidence? The difference is infinite. It's not a question of who is more important, me or God. If I'm evident, then what's in evidence is a finite being. And even though we're talking about the goodness of a finite being, we're talking about the nobility and the holiness and the Jewish instinct and impulse in a chassid who wants to have matzah on Pesach but can't get any, yet that too is finite. And no matter how great, no matter how advanced or how sophisticated the human being's Yiddishkeit or holiness or godliness can get, it will always remain finite. It can only be as big as he is. It's only so much. He cried bitter tears, but only so many tears. And they were bitter, but only so bitter. And the heart was breaking, but it's only such a heart. It's only one heart. It's infinite. I mean, it's finite. On the other hand, when we do the mitzvah, even if it's without kavanah, what we're revealing, what is being expressed, what is evident in the act of the mitzvah is God. And God, even in his smallest form, even in his most limited form, is essentially infinite. And the infinite is infinitely greater than the finite. This leads us to another interesting observation, an important observation. Throughout history, we read in the Gemara and in the prophets and in later writings that there were groups of Jews, philosophies among Jews, that stated that in order to serve God, you had to be a certain way. As, for example, the argument, the rift between Joseph and his brothers. It was a philosophical argument. Joseph said that wherever you are, you serve God. The brothers said, you can't serve God just anywhere. You can serve him only in an environment where you are protected from the influences of the secular world. When you're close to God, as when you're close to nature, when you're out tending the sheep, and you have plenty of time to meditate without distraction, then you can serve God. But if you go down to, let's say, Egypt, then forget it. There's no way you can be godly in Egypt. But Yosef says that's not true. In Egypt, involved with Egypt, you can serve God. And that's when they decided to test his theory, and they sold him. They said, okay, go to Egypt and let's see what happens. What was the brothers' mistake? Their mistake was that they limited the possibility of God's being available and evident to a given place, to a certain way of life. Only in the fields with the sheep can you serve God. And that's a mistake. And this repeated itself later, when in the times of Moshe, the Jews had come out of Egypt, but were refusing to go into Israel. And they said, we're better off being in the desert. It's easier to serve God in a desert where there are no distractions. But once we get into Israel, they argued, we'll have to be soldiers or farmers or politicians. We'll be distracted. We can't serve God that way. We today admire the kavanah, the intention, the feeling with which a person serves God far more than we admire the actual mitzvah. Why? Because we're convinced that God resides in the heart or in faith in certain places. We also have given God a certain limited location, physical location, and that's a little bit Christian, to say that God is available only through certain means. The rich, for example, will never get to heaven. It's holier to be poor. But that's not a way to serve God. We have this homemade definition that somehow serving God is connected with faith, innocence, virtue, fasting, poverty, prayer, celibacy. These we say are godly things. But the other is not godly. To be involved in business, to be rich, you can't possibly be godly. You can't possibly get to heaven if you're going to be married. You can't possibly get to heaven through eating, regardless of what you're eating. But this assumption, what we're doing when we make this kind of assumption, we're actually saying that God has to belong, God has to remain within a certain framework, because that's how our mind works. So we're actually creating God in our own image. We have fashioned in our own minds a definition for holiness and godliness, and then we force God to fit that definition. By saying that he is available only through the metaphysical, that he is available only in heaven, only through denial, only by being otherworldly, because in this world God cannot possibly make himself known or be perceived and discovered and touched and reached, then we are creating God in our own image. And that's very much like the man who says, I will be a perfect husband, whether you like it or not. He's bent on serving. The question is, whom is he serving? And as long as he's not serving God, then he has not yet left the realm of the finite, has not yet come in contact with the infinite. He hasn't stepped out of the borders of the restrictions of this world in order to come in contact with something greater, because he's not serving God. He is serving himself. He is serving his own image of right and wrong, of good and bad, and so on. Therefore, it's possible for a Jew to be learned, steeped in Yiddishkeit, in love with God, serving him every waking moment of his life, and yet he's really serving himself. He hasn't begun to serve God at all. But that's the problem with kavanah. Kavanah is the godliness that we are capable of, but we are capable of a very finite godliness. And we dare not limit God by our own limitations. We dare not say that because this is as far and as godly as I can get, therefore it is as godly as God can get. In doing the act of the mitzvah, even if it's without the kavanah, then we are recognizing, we are in touch with, we are in contact with what God is and what God decides he wants to be. So God decides what he wants of us and how he wants us to serve him. And if he says he wants to be served in Egypt, then fine. Why not? God is everywhere. God is infinite. God is who he is. And if he wants to be served through eating and not through fasting, then fine, we will serve him through eating. And we can't sit here and tell him what he should want or how he needs to be served. if we're going to serve him, it will have to be the way he wants to be served and what he wants. Otherwise, we're not serving him, we're serving ourselves. Somebody once called it spiritual gluttony. We want to be spiritual. We want to be very spiritual. We want to have a lot of goodness in our lives, a lot of virtue in our lives. And so we do all these wonderful things that are written in Torah, in Yiddishkeit, but in fact it's gluttony. We're not serving God, we're serving ourselves. And that is the importance of the act. When you add it all together, the kavanah is important, but it doesn't compare to the importance of the act. And that's what the simple statement in the Gemara, where it says, it is not the study that is essential, but rather it is the act. How essential is the act? Infinitely. How non-essential is the kavanah? Infinitely. But the kavanah also has its purpose. When you do a mitzvah with kavanah, the mitzvah is compared to a bird with wings. A mitzvah without kavanah is a bird without wings. Now the analogy is a carefully chosen one. When you have a bird without wings, which is the essential part? You have a bird without wings, or have wings without a bird? Obviously, the bird without the wings is still a living creature, but wings without a bird is nothing. There shouldn't be wings without birds. So when you have kavanah without the mitzvah, then you're actually serving yourself. Not only isn't it a mitzvah, it borders on idol worship. You're worshiping yourself. You're worshiping your own spirituality. When we have both, then the kavanah and the act of the mitzvah, then we have a bird with wings, which means a mitzvah performed in the physical, but not limited by the physical. And that's what we mean by a mitzvah that rises. It is a mitzvah because it is performed the way Torah prescribes it. And every mitzvah has its physical dimensions. But at the same time, it rises. It leaves the limits of this world because it is basically God's will. It is His will, and His will is infinite. So when do the two really come together and become one, the mitzvah and the act? When you eat the matzah, when you put on the tefillin, when you go to the mikveh, there is the act and there is the kavanah. How do you feel about the matzah on Pesach? Would you cry if you didn't have matzah on Pesach? There's the act and there's the kavanah. When you have them both, fine. If you have them both, but they're distinct things, two separate things. We find in Torah an interesting exception. There is a commandment to love God. Now, what happens here? With this commandment, which is the act and which is the kavanah? How do you fulfill the mitzvah of loving God, and how do you separate the mitzvah from its kavanah? In order to do the mitzvah, to just do the mitzvah, you love God. And what is the kavanah? The feeling with which you're doing the mitzvah. So here, the mitzvah and the kavanah are really one and the same. In this particular commandment, the kavanah and the act merge. But what we're usually overlooking is that we assume that loving God is our condition. We love God. And now that we love God, now we're ready to serve Him. But that's not true. To love God is also a commandment. That too is already a service of God. As if to say, if a person is born loving God, then he's got a problem. How is he going to fulfill the mitzvah of loving God? If he already loves Him by disposition and by personality, then it's too late. Then he can't do it as a mitzvah. So in our mistaken understanding of godliness, we admire the person who is born loving God, because in fact, as a person, he is more admirable. But again, that also is his limit. His love for God will never be infinite, because how much can a person love? Only as much as a human being is capable of loving, and that's not infinite, not very much. So if he loves God with all his heart, so how much is that? Look at how he loves his kids. Look at how he loves his wife. And that's with all his heart. So why do we love God? Why do we fear God? Not because it's the spiritual thing to be, the spiritual way to be, but because God said, love me. He said, And again, going back to the analogy of the husband and the wife, if the husband keeps loving his wife, but she doesn't ask for it, that's not the way she wants to be treated, then obviously it's not a mitzvah, it's not a relationship, it's not going to work. If God hadn't commanded, you should love God, your God, with all your heart, then it would be no mitzvah. It would not be a bridge between the finite and the infinite. It wouldn't be a Torah virtue. It would be a human virtue, but not a Yiddishkeit virtue. And the idea is that from our finite condition, we're supposed to rise to something above and beyond our finite, and that is our Creator. And the only way that happens is when He reaches out to us with a mitzvah and tells us what He wants us to do. If it's something He wants, then we are connected with Him. If it's not something He wants, then no matter how beautiful it is, or how moving or touching it is, it's not Him. It's still just us. Also, there's a commandment to know God, not just to believe in Him, but to know Him. And what does it mean to command knowledge? Usually we think that knowing is a human need. If you're an intelligent being, you want to know. So when a Jew sits down to study, he wants to know about God. So what is he doing? Is he giving in to his human needs, intelligent human needs, the need for answers, the need for explanation? But then he's not studying Torah. He's pursuing his own intelligence. He's not trying to understand God. He's trying to make sense in his own mind. He's trying to unravel his own thoughts. So he's not getting any closer to God himself, even if he is studying theology. And that's why there are hundreds and thousands of people who study theology, and yet they're not any closer to a mitzvah. They're not any closer to God than they were when they started. There was a woman here a number of years ago, and we got into a conversation about getting closer to God. And she was into a spiritual dance. That's what she did. She was a dancer. And she did this religious kind of ecstatic dance and claimed that when she danced, she felt closer to God. And I'm trying to tell her that the only way to get closer to God is through doing a mitzvah. So she says, well, that's your way, but I feel closer to God when I dance. So let's, for the sake of argument, assume that she is getting closer to God. But I asked her, how would you know if in fact you were getting closer to God? How could you tell? And she says, well, because it feels special. But special is not God. You can feel special because it's relaxing or uplifting or for any number of reasons. What does it have to do with God? And she says, no, but it's not that kind of feeling. It's a powerful feeling. So, well, maybe you're getting closer to Satan. Maybe you're getting in touch with the devil. That's powerful, but not good. So how do you know what you're feeling? How would you know if you were feeling closer to God? If you were getting closer to God, how would you recognize it? So she says, well, okay, how would I recognize it? If a person has just been to a swamp, how would you recognize it? Well, you would expect to find mud on their boots. A person's been out in the rain, how would you recognize it? Well, you expect his hat to be wet. You come back with the impression of what you've been in touch with. If you've been close to God, what would you come back with? The 10 Commandments. You wouldn't be wet or muddy. You'd come back with 10 commandments. If a person has been closer to God, then he is no longer capable of committing adultery, for example. So she says, well, in that case, I guess I wasn't getting closer to God. We can study theology. We can love God, pray to Him 3 times a day, even go through the acts of the mitzvah, and not be any closer to Him because we're doing it all for our own satisfaction. I need to understand, so I study theology. I need to be spiritual, so I do religious things. I need to feel uplifted, so I love God. But it's all me. In order to have our attitude, our head-on right about the mitzvah, even those things that we recognize or assume are human needs, the need to understand, for example, or the desire to love, we don't do even those things because of our own desire and need. God said, know me. That's why we study to know God, not because we need explanation. God said, love me. That's why we daven and arouse a feeling of love for God. Not because it's our need, but because this too is a mitzvah. Usually we think making a bracha, that's a mitzvah. But loving God, that's my love. That's me. That's how I feel. I love God. But if that's all it is, then it's a finite love. If I love God because that's what God wants, then I've got both the kavanah and the infinite wrapped into one. The devotion, the wanting to understand the world, has to be subjected to a higher purpose, to bring us into a higher realm, to introduce us to a higher world. Here's a simple example. A simple man in the world of a king. In the king's world, the simple man really doesn't exist at all, because he's totally insignificant. So the world of the king and the world of the simple man are mutually exclusive. They exist in the same universe, but they are worlds apart. When the simple man does an act, runs an errand for the king, he may not understand what the purpose of the errand is. Chances are he won't. He will certainly not understand the full implications of what he's doing. He's delivering a message from one king to another, but does he know what it says? He can't even read the language. But the message is so vital that it can determine the outcome of a local war, of a global war, and the well-being of all the citizens of this country and the world. The guy doesn't know anything about this. All he's doing is delivering the message. He's doing the act. In terms of kavanah, he's totally incapable of figuring out what the king is up to. But the fact that he does the errand makes him not only exist in the king's world, but actually gives him a certain amount of significance in the world of the king. Not only does the king recognize that a simple man exists, he also recognizes that a simple man can be useful, like the lion who needed the mouse. So should the simple person not only do the act, but do it with enthusiasm? And what is his enthusiasm? He's excited about the importance of his mission. He knows nothing about the importance of the mission. He can't be excited about the mission because he doesn't understand it. What is he excited about? He's excited that he is doing something for a great king. That's his excitement. So when the simple person is thrilled to be serving a king, then all of a sudden there is not only a factual relationship, there's also a human relationship. Not only is he running an errand for the king, he's also connecting with the king in his heart. And on the king's part, not only does he recognize the existence of the simple person, not only does he recognize the significance of this person, he begins to have a feeling for the person. Because the joy and the enthusiasm with which the simple man runs his errand evokes within the king an equal response. The devotion is a human element, a feeling, and it evokes a human feeling in the king as well. So the connection between the king and the simple man can be warm, or it can be just a matter of fact. The king can recognize the significance of a simple man, or only the existence of the simple man. But the quantum leap, the infinite jump, happens when the simple man does the act. Then the infinite gap between them is already bridged. After that, it can be bridged a little better and yet better, and various levels and degrees of bridging, but the big step has already been taken. The simple man exists in the world of a king. In terms of mitzvahs, if we were noble and spiritual and high-minded, and therefore put together our own prayers and our own sentiments to God, and created all sorts of worship forms with which to serve God, then we would be good people. But we would be infinitely removed from God. The only way we connect to God is if and when He says, "Do this for me," and then we do it. And how do we then connect with Him? Only when we do that which He wants, because He wants it. So the intention behind the mitzvah, the kavanah behind the mitzvah, is a connection between me serving God and serving God. And that is, when I do according to my understanding, according to my feelings, according to my condition, but what do I do? What He wants. Our grandparents did mitzvahs. Our grandfathers put on tefillin, and we put on tefillin. Our grandmothers kept kosher and went to the mikveh. Obviously, They were doing it from a completely different orientation, with a completely different feeling, with a completely different understanding and appreciation of what they were doing than when we keep those same mitzvahs, when we keep kosher or go to the mikveh. And that has to be. They lived in a different world. But what were they doing? Which mitzvah did they appreciate in their own unique way? The mitzvah of tefillin, the same tefillin we put on today. What mitzvah do we appreciate, enjoy, and perform in our own insignificant, unique way? The mitzvah of tefillin, not some other. So when the husband, going back to that to the analogy in the marriage, when the husband uses his ingenuity, motivated by his own feelings for his wife, but he does what she wants, then he is a husband to his wife. But if motivated by his feelings, motivated by his intelligence, motivated by his understanding of what it is to be a husband, he does what he wants for his wife, then he's not a husband at all. There is no relationship. Therefore, we needn't get confused by the question of spontaneity and enthusiasm versus mitzvah. There is the spontaneity and enthusiasm with which we are supposed to do the mitzvah. But the act of the mitzvah is already predetermined. Tefillin have to be a certain way and have to be worn a certain way and on certain days of the week. There is no alternative. You can't be creative in the mitzvah. You can't say, well, I'm not a machine. I'm not just going to go through motions. I have to figure it out myself. By all means, have some input. Put your feelings into it. Put your understanding into it. Put your unique stamp to it. But do it, not something else. Every husband is a husband in his own way, and he's a husband to his wife, not to himself. He responds to his wife's need, and he responds in his own unique way. But it has to be his wife's need that he is responding to. And so when we do mitzvahs, we're actually doing two things. On the one hand, we are told that if God wants you to put on tefillin, it makes no sense to say, what for? My father already did it. He did it 50 years. It was a different world then, 50 years ago. It was a different world then. He was a different person. And therefore, when you put on tefillin, you're not repeating what your father has done. You're not duplicating. There is no duplicating. And in God's plan, he never calls for a repeat. So the tefillin that your grandfather put on was the same mitzvah, but you are not the same person. And so it doesn't make sense to say God has enough tefillin already. For thousands of years, people have been putting on tefillin. So what's going to be so terrible if I don't put on tefillin? It doesn't make sense to say that, because when you put on tefillin, it's not at all equal or the same as your father putting on tefillin, or your grandfather or great-grandfather, because you're coming to it with a whole different set of emotions, with a different set of experiences, with a different understanding. So in that sense, it's a completely unique mitzvah. You're not a machine at all. It's you doing the mitzvah, and that's never been done before. To take that a step further, if you put on tefillin yesterday and you're going to put on tefillin again today, it is two different mitzvahs, because you are not the same today as you were yesterday. You're a day older and you've changed slightly. So you never duplicate. You're lighting candles and you feel you're connected with your mother and your grandmother and your great-grandmother all the way back to Sarah. True. But at the same time, what you're doing has never been done before, because no one quite like you ever lit candles before, because there never was a you before. So on the one hand, when we do a mitzvah, we're doing something completely original and unique, but on the other hand, it is exactly the same mitzvah, and the sense of continuity is also real and valid. So the tefillin that the little bar mitzvah boy puts on today in his local synagogue on the day of his bar mitzvah are exactly the same tefillin that Moses would wear in his day. They could, if they met in some time warp, they could exchange tefillin. Because when you look at the construction, say, of a mikveh, and these old mikvehs that they dig up in Masada, for example, and other places, it's exactly the same mikveh as the mikveh we use today. built to the same specifications. Of course, our mikveh is a little bit more modern, but the specifications are the same. Obviously, the woman today who goes to the mikveh is going to the mikveh with a different feeling, with a different orientation, with a different understanding than her great-grandmother in the times of Masada. So we have at the same time the infinite, unchanging, eternal mitzvah, which is the act of the mitzvah, and then there's the constantly changing, the constantly new, the constantly original kavanah of the mitzvah, the personal input that you bring to the mitzvah. So is it the intention that counts? Is it the thought that counts? In terms of our own worth, in terms of how much of a mensch we are, yes, it counts. In terms of the infinite plan for creation, it counts very little. There the act counts. To bring it down to today, the Rebbe has been talking recently in very frightening terms about the state of affairs of this world. This is not the Rebbe's statement, but somebody put it interestingly. Somebody in the news described it this way. He said, "We are the first generation to be faced with the possibility of being the last." It's a pretty awesome thing, but it's very real. If things don't maintain their balance, which at this moment is very precarious to begin with, there's no telling how bad things can get. And that balance can be lost very easily. So the Rambam said 850 years ago that we are to see the world as being balanced between good and evil, between deserving and undeserving, and that the very next act which we are about to make is going to tilt the scale in one direction or the other. The very thought can if it's a good thought or if it's a bad thought, this can determine whether the world will, a moment from now, be found deserving or undeserving, worth saving or, God forbid, not worth saving. And that's why the Rebbe has been so urgent to we have to do something to maintain the balance of the world, to keep the world from turning itself over. And what makes the difference is not going to be one bullet more or one bullet less. The difference has to be a greater amount of virtue for the world, a world deserving to be protected, people deserving to be protected from themselves. So the next mitzvah can make all the difference for the world. So the Rebbe is asking that we give more charity, that we say extra additional prayers these days, that we be a little bit more careful with the mitzvahs that he's been urging us to do for the last 6 years or more, because we're down to the wire. It's come to the point where a little bit of goodness can save the world. And certainly that goodness can make the difference in the world. The goodness that will make the difference is not our own finite goodness. I am a good person, I mean well. That's not going to help. The goodness we need is the infinite goodness, the presence of God in this world, in our favor. How do we bring God into this world? How does God become evident in this world, comfortable in this world? Through the act of the mitzvah. Doing what he wants because he wants. And that's why the Rebbe turns to children. That children should give tzedakah. That children should say prayers. Because a child's intentions are really very insignificant. A child's virtue is his innocence. So when the child does a mitzvah, he does so innocently. The child serves God because God wants to be served. So in terms of kavanah, the child has very little. When we talk about the virtue of a child, we don't talk about their intent and their purpose and their kavanah in the mitzvah. We talk about their innocence, because they have no ulterior motives. They have no motives at all. They do what they're told. And the innocence is in this case more important than the kavanah. Because what can change the course of the world is the act of the mitzvah, not the kavanah. The presence of God, not the presence of good intentions. So in doing the mitzvah, we bring heaven to earth. In having the kavanah, we raise the earth a little bit towards heaven. Through the kavanah, through the mitzvah, we bring God to earth. Through the kavanah, we elevate our own earthly condition a little bit closer to God.